朋友们，大家好。今天要分享的视频是法国经济学家路易斯·加夫2024年8月接受媒体采访的节选。路易斯·加夫出生于一个投资世家，他和他的父亲一样，都是著名的投资人和经济学家。路易斯·加夫关注全球的资本流动、利率趋势、通胀动态，包括地缘政治。他尤其关注亚洲新兴市场，特别是中国的表现。很早就预见到中国的崛起以及亚洲市场的机遇。例如2003年非典疫情过后，全球对中国市场的担忧一度加剧，但路易斯认为中国将凭借其庞大的制造业基础和政府高效的政策应对能力迅速恢复，并在未来成为全球制造业中心。事实证明他的观点是正确的。随后几年，中国经济实现了高速增长。在这一阶段，他鼓励投资者配置与中国经济高度相关的资产，例如大宗商品、基础设施投资和新兴市场股票基金。他提出，随着中国的基础设施建设和城市化进程加速，钢铁、铜和能源将成为长期受益的资产。实际上，从2004年到2008年，全球大宗商品价格迎来一轮超级周期。铜价从每吨约2000美元上涨到近9000美元，铁矿石价格也大幅飙升，这与中国的旺盛需求直接相关。2009年金融危机后，路易斯预见到中国将在国际贸易中逐步减少对美元的依赖，推动人民币国际化进程。他在报告中提到，中国的崛起不仅体现在经济总量上，更重要的是其货币将在全球扮演越来越重要的角色。随后，中国确实逐步推动人民币跨境结算，并加入了国际货币基金组织的特别提款权 SDR 一篮子货币，验证了他的预测。在2010年代初，他曾多次强调，投资者应该关注中国的科技股，尤其是与移动互联网、人工智能相关的企业。例如，他提到腾讯、阿里巴巴等公司是新经济的代表，具有长期增长潜力。事实证明，这个方向是正确的。视频最后，主持人问他对美中脱钩可能性的看法，他是怎么说的呢？我们一起来看看吧。
Okay, can I say two things in response to that, to give the counter take? And the first is, I'll say, what about American dynamism with respect to technology? I mean, we have the Mag 7 in this country, and AI is the next big thing to revolutionize the world in the way that the internet did. So that's one thing I'll say, and park that idea. The second is the US has a fantastic history with respect to its capital markets, and its, let's call them settlement assurances, a history of like property rights, let's say. And so what are you telling us? Like, you're going to go to an emerging country that doesn't have this history and maybe has a history of like revolutions or some political instability. We're going to go to China, and like where government has de facto rights that like certainly they don't have in the US. So I'll say those two things. Basically, there's a premium because America has a property rights system and capital markets second to none. So we just benefit from that premium. And firstly, we also have the Mag 7. We have tech. Like AI is absolutely massive, and don't fade it.
So I'll start off with the second one, because the property rights are indeed super important. And I wish that perhaps we could have some Iranians or Venezuelans or Russians or Sudanese on this call, because you could tell them all about American property rights and they'd be delighted to hear about them. Because if you were Russian and you owned a property in New York or a property in Miami or some bonds or some US equities, they were just taken from you without trial, without anything, just at the stroke of a pen. And this started really about 10 years ago with Sudan, and then it moved to Venezuela, and then it moved to Iran, and then it moved to Russia. And so increasingly, I think if you're foreign, I think you fall increasingly into one of two categories. You've got the category of foreigners like me who are French, I'm French, who think, yeah, I'm safe in the US, US isn't going to take away my assets because I'm French. But if I'm Chinese, if I'm Saudi, if I'm Qatari, if I start to think, well, if my leaders don't do what the US tells them to do, then do I get all my stuff confiscated? And it's starting to be a doubt in the back of my mind.
So you're saying the property rights are good, but only good if you are a U.S. aligned country and a U.S. aligned
Well, how can you not come to that conclusion with everything that's happened in recent years? And if your property rights are not sacrosanct, if they're dependent on who you are and where you're from, then they're not property rights at all. Let's call a spade. If your property rights depend, I'll say it again, on who you are and where you're from, then they're not property rights.
How about our tech? How about US dynamism around like big tech and AI, and it's certainly taken the places the world leader there?
Okay. So what is the purpose of tech? What is the purpose of tech? The purpose of tech, I would argue, is to produce better things at a cheaper cost, right? To enhance productivity, to, sure, it's nice to get puppy videos on the internet, and I laugh, and it's nice, etc. But deep down, the purpose of technology is to enhance productivity, produce more at a cheaper cost. So with that in mind, yes, the US has Max 7, and it's awesome. What goods and service does the US today produce at a cheaper cost than other countries? Because what I see,
there's a long silence because I can't, nothing really comes to mind. You're talking about like physical goods, right? You're not talking about brands. You're not talking about media. You're not talking about software.
What has US tech done for US cities? I travel in the US all the time. It feels each time I go, New York is worse than the previous time. What is
this reminds me of the Peter Thiel take of like, where are flying cars? Basically, like productivity has languished, and tech has innovated and made a whole bunch of people rich from network effects, and the result has been things like Google and social media. But like, these aren't necessarily adding to the two things that tech is supposed to do, which is productivity increases and like quality of life increases.
So, and I was actually, since you bring that up, over the past 10 years, so the US spends 18% of its GDP on healthcare. And for the past 10 years, the life expectancy has been falling. The US is one of the few countries in the world with a falling life expectancy. And I always point to this when people tell me, talk about it, US exceptionalism, we're so far ahead of everybody on tech, et cetera. It's like, well, how come people are dying younger? Like, how can that be? How can the US now have a worse life expectancy than China? Like, isn't this mind-blowing? Like, 20 years ago, the US was living 20 years longer than China. Now, you look, you go to Shanghai today, you go to Beijing, and I can show you all the ways that tech has revolutionized those cities. From the fake tech on your phone in terms of ordering cabs, in terms of from the trains that are fast, work on time, the traffic that gets regulated, all these things, you do see it. But you don't have the massive tech billionaires that you have in the US. That's for sure. But the Max 7s, you could say, well, smartphone is awesome, and it is. And Apple's created a great ecosystem, and it has. And as a result, Apple has gone from trading at 10 times earnings 20 years ago to 35 times earnings today. Do we think Apple goes from 35 times earnings that are, by the way, no longer growing to 70 times earnings? If not, why do I want to own this stock?
I think that's the key point of the investment conclusion here. It's just, you're not saying that basically the US economy is like dead and there's no innovation, there's no bright spots here. You're just saying, hey, it's overvalued relative to other things, which brings in the question, okay, what other things? The statement is non-US equities are attractive relative to US equities. So like where in the, like,
I'll give you a simple example. I'd much rather own Tencent, which has 15% of its balance sheet, of its market cap in cash on the balance sheet.
So Chinese equities would be a place, Chinese tech equities.
I think you have to go look into individual equities, but I look at a company like Tencent, and it's a video game play, it's a fintech play, it's a social media play, and, all under one roof, all integrated, and, trading at whatever it is, 13 times earnings, 14 times earnings. It's, growing double digit every year. This seems to me like a much better proposition than an Apple trading at 35 times, whose sales haven't grown for the past 4 or 5 years now.
I'll give you that. Let me ask you too, though, if you're looking at these markets as a citizen of France, right? Yeah. Are you worried that your property rights in China around buying Tencent or something like this are good if you are a citizen of China, in the same way they're good in the West if you're kind of like under the umbrella of the US capital apparatus. But if you're from France or you're from the US or somewhere in Europe that is kind of like, I guess in this bipolar world, US aligned, maybe your property rights are going to be like not good. So maybe what you're saying works for like someone in China who's listening to this podcast and they're like, okay, yeah, sign me up. I'm already all in the risk here in my jurisdiction. I may as well buy Tencent, but maybe it doesn't work as well for a citizen of the West.
So when did the Chinese government ever seize the assets of a Western citizen? Now, I'm asking, because I can show you plenty of examples of Western governments seizing the assets of Russians, of Iranians, of Venezuelans, etc., because their government didn't do what they were told. But have we seen China do that?
Not yet, no. And I mean, this brings into question of...
So are we not projecting ourselves onto China? It's like, we've done it, so we expect them to do it as well.
To be fair, probably in a retaliatory position, it almost doesn't matter who starts doing it first. Do you know what I mean? So if you get into a circumstance where, let's say, China is not the aggressor in this type of capital freeze type of situation, and they're put in this position where they're always responding to, say, like Western aggression to freeze assets, you get into a tit for tat scenario where it almost doesn't matter who the original aggressor was. You could still think of a world where...
If we go down that path, the entire global economy freezes and it becomes a moot point anyway. No. Look. You're talking. The world you're describing is a world where Apple can no longer produce in China, where Tesla can no longer produce in China.
Everything's going down in
where
that
Walmart
world.
Can no longer produce in China. In this world, you have 150% inflation rate in the United States. In this world, it's, and of course it can happen. China, the U.S. tomorrow can say, I want nothing to do with you. I seize all your assets. I completely lock you out, etc. But let's not kid ourselves that, if this happens, stocks everywhere are down 90%. So at this point, it becomes a moot point anyway.
I guess I'm just kind of wondering what you think is the base case here. Is there going to be effectively the world split up into kind of two blocks, the China aligned type blocks and the US blocks, and then maybe there's this third group of kind of independents, India and such? Like, how do you think the world will kind of bifurcate? Are you a believer in the great decoupling type of idea? And if so, how do you think that happens?
I'm not really a believer in it because for all the talk, I mean, obviously it's been all the talk of politics, etc., for the past 5-6 years. But if you look today, that China exports, pretty much just as much to the US as they did 5 years ago. And then if you include all the Chinese companies that have set up factories in Mexico and Vietnam and Indonesia to sell to the US, then, indirect Chinese exports plus direct Chinese exports are like massively at record highs. The reality is, for all the talk of deglobalization, global trade continues to expand and expand rapidly. Having said that, where you're seeing the fastest growth in global trade, it's emerging markets to emerging markets. And here, I think you have to start off with the reality that China is running $100 billion a month trade surpluses. That's just gargantuan amounts of money. And that 5 years ago, when really the US started bashing China like crazy, that number was $40 billion a month. So, to put things in perspective, China was running trade surplus of $40 billion a month. The US said, you know what? China's a bad actor. They're like bad hombres. We need to cut these guys off from the global trading system. And over that period, China's trade surplus has gone from $40 billion a month to $100 billion a month. So talk about a complete failure of policy. People in the Western world, in Washington, D.C., should be looking at themselves the people who came up with the idea of we're going to cut off China from the global trading system should be hanging their heads in shame. Now you could argue, well, if they hadn't done that, it'd be 200 billion. But let's not kid ourselves. 100 billion is the biggest trade surplus any country has ever had in history. It's bigger than Japan's biggest trade surplus plus Germany's biggest trade surplus ever in history put together. So if that money, instead of being recycled into US treasuries, instead of being recycled into Microsoft and Apple shares, starts to stay at home, that's enough to bid up your currencies, bid up your bonds, bid up your equities.
Yeah, I mean, I think you could also argue for all of that hard talk about kind of like, trade and decoupling. It's just like political posturing, and they didn't really mean it, because the incentives and the game theory is just like not to do that. I mean, global trade kind of like benefits everybody when it works well. I guess maybe
on this, I think it's a very important point. You might say, oh, it's political posturing and they don't mean it, etc., and they don't follow through with anything. All of which is probably right. But now, if you're China on the other side of it, let's imagine you're Xi Jinping and you're hearing all this noise all day, every day. We need to cut China off. We can't give them semiconductors. We can't do this. We can't do that. We need to isolate them. Do you say, they don't mean it? Oh, they don't? No. You have to adjust your policies in accordance to these very hostile declarations coming out of Washington, D.C. Concretely, what does this mean? This means giving preferential trading and tax treatments to countries like Indonesia, to Thailand, to the whole of Africa. It means going in there and offering cheap loans for them to buy your goods. It means trying desperately to crack open new markets. And this is where China's growth has come from. So, we could say, oh, well, we say all these things, but we don't really mean it. It doesn't matter. But on the flip side, China behaves as if it does matter. And when you look at China's growth in trade with Central Asia, with Russia, with Southeast Asia, with Africa, it's all gone absolutely parabolic.